All right. So thank you so much for joining us today. I am Swapnil Rai, Assistant Professor in the Department of Film, TV, and Media here at Michigan. And this is the first talk of our winter 2022 academic lecture series for the center. The next talk after Usha's will be on January 28th, which is about spatializing Islam during the early Cold War, the Ahmadi question in Munir Kayani report in Pakistani literature with Cara Ciliano, Department of English. She's the Associate Dean at Michigan State University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Usha Iyer today. They are an assistant professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. Usha is a native of... Okay, I don't know why my voice is echoing. Maybe somebody needs to be muted. Okay, Usha is a native of Bombay. They studied literature, film, and video production and cultural studies in Bombay, Pune, and Hyderabad before they got their PhD in film studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Their book, Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, has been shortlisted for the British Association of South Asian Studies 2022 Book Prize. Dr. Iyer's presentation today draws from their own experience in the Caribbean, which has inspired their next book project, which is a study of the affective engagements of Caribbean spectators with Indian cinema and the impact of Caribbean performance forms on Indian film industries. Dr. Iyer taught at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad from 2014 to 2015, which kind of sparked off their interest in these connections between India and the Caribbean, connections that they had learned little to nothing about in India, like most Indians. But at UWI, Dr. Iyer taught a course on Indian cinema and curated a film series with the Indian Consulate in Trinidad. And while the pandemic has put a spanner in research travel, they hope to make it back to the Caribbean very soon. And it is a great pleasure to have Dr. Iyer with us today. So I would hand over the mic to Dr. Iyer, and as I do so, please remember to mute yourselves. And as her talk progresses, if you have questions, you can send those questions to me directly in the chat as you think about them, or after the talk, you can use the raise hand icon, Zoom icon, and we will take your questions then. All right, Dr. Iyer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Swapnil, for that kind introduction. And thanks everyone for being here today on what is a sort of late evening on the East Coast. I'd really hoped to be there in Ann Arbor, which I haven't visited, but I hope to someday when the world is less crazy than it is right now. I'd like to thank the Center for South Asian Studies for inviting me to speak, to present work from my new book project. And many thanks also to Clemente Beghi for taking care of all the logistics for this event. I'll share my screen. Can you see that? Okay, great. So I must begin with the disclaimer that this is very new work and emerges from a sort of pandemic research mode with no travel, interviews conducted online, and a lot of social media trawling to get a sense of the affective communities of film and music fandom that are forming more recently across multiple geographies. So I welcome your feedback as I develop this project. It's in its very early stages. And hopefully, inshallah, I will get to travel to the Caribbean and to India this summer. As Swapnil mentioned, in 2014-15, I taught in the film department at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. In the time that has followed, I have often been asked about my experience teaching a course on Indian cinema in particular in Trinidad. and have thought back to the intensely invested, passionate, and sometimes factious discussions in that vibrant mixed race, multi-ethnic class of Afro, Indo, Chinese, Syrian, and white Trinidadian students, Syrian in Trinidad being a broad descriptor of immigrants from the Middle East, while white Trinidadians, or quote unquote local whites, are the descendants of European settlers. So just to give you a sense of who was in that classroom. My identity in the Indian cinema class was positioned between being a native informant, born and raised in India, a quote unquote India Indian in Trini speak, and a US trained academic. Having taught in India, in the United States, and in Trinidad, I began to see how these varying contexts and performances of pedagogical identities were informing the ways in which I teach and think about Indian cinema. My second book project is a study of the traffic of cultural forms between South Asia and the Caribbean. It examines the deep affective engagement of Caribbean spectators with Indian cinema in relation to discourses of belonging and citizenship that have developed around the histories of African enslavement and Indian indentureship in Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and Guyana. At a time when differences and solidarities among BIPOC communities are being vigorously discussed here in the US, this long history of I seem to have been muted. I hope you can hear me now. Okay. So at a time when differences and solidarities among BIPOC communities are being debated in the US, this long history of Black and Brown relations in the Caribbean invites us to engage with transnational perspectives on race and media from what is considered the global South. Through film spectatorship and embodied fandom, this project aims to trace the creation of cinematic intimacies across the different forms of racialized labor migration during the periods of plantation capitalism, post-plantation life in decolonized independent nation states, and neoliberal globalization today. This intermedial, in that it spans film, radio, TV, and digital media, multi-generational and multi-sited project that moves between South Asia, the Caribbean, and Caribbean diasporas in North America and the UK. This project engages with crucial contemporary questions of racial and religious frictions and solidarities across locations that are not often studied together. The book also centrally examines the impact of Caribbean cultural forms on the Indian film industry, which appropriated soca and other musical and performance forms to approximate a Creole modernity. Rather than posit one-way flows from homeland to diaspora, this project unearths the circularity of borrowings and appropriations to produce a polycentric account of the traffic of sensory, embodied forms of knowledge across informal media networks. In today's talk, I examine how a little-known circuit of musicians and performers in orchestras carried reverberations from their wildly popular Caribbean shows to produce innovations in the aural scape of India's film capital, Bombay. Sounds that traveled from Africa to the Caribbean made their intermixed, embodied way to India, harnessing echoes across the oceans of performative collaborations between African and Indian descended workers in the Caribbean since the late 19th century. Within film studies, there mainly exist examinations of Hollywood's impact on global film culture, with little scholarship on the cultural work that other popular cinemas have done in transnational circuits. Even in the more specialized areas of Indian and South Asian cinema studies, much of the focus has been on film production and exhibition within the subcontinent and in the newer so-called first world Indian diasporas of Europe and North America. And within Caribbean studies, while ethnomusicologists have studied the dazzling mélange of hybrid musical forms of the Caribbean, the sustained presence of Indian cinema has received scant attention. By foregrounding South-South film and media traffic, this project aims to extend and enrich conversations on race, media, and identity. Kaveh Askari and Samita Shunya, in their special issue, South by Southwest Asia, Transregional Histories of Middle East and South Asian Cinemas, note that South by South networks have had a far greater impact on cinema histories than the field has acknowledged, demonstrating how inter-regional affiliations revise the geographies of cinema historiography. Through a combination of archival, textual, and ethnographic methods, this project aims to examine how Indian film spectatorship produces intimacies and frictions across racial, gender, and religious differences. Media intimacies across transoceanic creolized geographies map media networks across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans that remind us of the connections among various communities differentially affected and impacted by empire. In response to an assignment prompt in my Indian cinema course at the University of the West Indies, for instance, a student interviewed her aunt, both of them of African descent. And the aunt remarked, "I grew up on this cinema. I would sit down and cry when the movie was done and Amitabh Bachchan, a major Indian film star, had died. Indian films united not only family members for an afternoon, but races for a lifetime," noted my student's aunt. Films remain with us long after we leave the movie hall or turn off our TV sets and other devices. Images, sounds, gestures, and ideas come to reside in our bodies and communities. For decades, when Indo and Afro-Caribbean families sat down in a weekly Sunday ritual to watch an Indian film on state television, they were forging cultural and emotional intimacies, even amidst racially divisive political discourse. So just to conclude this kind of opening description of the larger book project that I've just begun to work on, some of the key driving questions of this project include: what do we understand of racial and ethnic relations through cinematic spectatorship and fandom? How does cinema produce intimacies between Black and Brown subjectivities, histories, and performance traditions? How do media intimate past and possible future intimacies? And what is it about our intimacy with media that allows for these relationships to develop? At a time when racial and religious difference dominate political discourse in these multiple locations that I'm studying, a historically grounded return to the pulsating energies of cinematic creolization takes on vital significance, just as a comparative study of race and ethnicity in multiple locations is critical for understanding our globalized and yet deeply unequal world. To move to today's talk, let me begin with a brief description of the Indo-Caribbean community, part of what scholars like Tina Ramnarayan have referred to as the old Indian diaspora. Manas Ray has described it as plantation Raj diasporas, and Tejaswini Niranjana as subaltern diasporas. This diaspora was created by the transportation of nearly 1.5 million Indians to British, French, and Dutch plantations in the Caribbean, Fiji, South Africa, and Mauritius as indentured or contracted labor from 1838 to 1917, after the abolition of the slave trade. Today, alongside African descendants, they constitute the two major racial groups in Trinidad and Guyana, with political lines often drawn along these racialized identities. Since its arrival in the Caribbean in the 1930s, Indian cinema has been a central cultural presence across Indian and African descended communities through widespread exhibition in movie halls, on state-run radio and television networks, and shows by musical orchestras. To study Indian cinema in the Caribbean is inherently an intermedial project. For more than the narratives of popular Hindi cinema, what circulates through the air is the music from these films, both in its quote-unquote original form and mashed up into chutney and soca. And given that popular music is a key site of cultural politics in the Caribbean, following the cultural traffic between India and the Caribbean takes us through negotiations of race, ethnicity, region, gender, and sexuality in each of these locations. The main form of public Caribbean engagement with Indian cinema is through live shows by music orchestras. So that fandom is centrally an embodied response through music and dance, rather than identifications with characters or cinematic narratives. Hindi cinema's travels in the Caribbean then can be plotted through what is by design the peripatetic form of film music. Scholars like Tina Ramnarayan, Tejaswini Niranjana, Helen Myers have discussed as well the orchestra phenomenon, starting with the establishment in 1944 of the Naya Zamana Orchestra, followed by more than 100 such Indian orchestras through the 1970s. It is this context of embodied fan practices, of spirited dancing, sing-alongs, TV talent shows, and recorded and informal mashups that my protagonists for today's talk, Babla and Kanchan, enter in the 1970s. So let me open with a clip from Babla Kanchan's song. Let me just pause there. Tracing the flows between Hindi film music and Caribbean music led me to the Indian singer music arranger duo Babla and Kanchan, who gained fame as chutney music performers across the Caribbean and its diaspora. Babla Shah, younger brother of the famous Hindi film music composers Kalyanji and Anandji, was a rhythm arranger and music producer in Bombay, and first visited Trinidad with the renowned Indian playback singer Mukesh in 1967. And there are accounts of other playback singers like Manna Dey and Mohammad Rafi doing concerts in Trinidad and Guyana as well during this period. Babla then returned to Trinidad with his orchestra and his singer wife, Kanchan Dinkerao Mali or Kanchan Shah, to do wildly popular music shows through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, not just in the Caribbean, but across the Indian diasporas in Mauritius, Fiji, South Africa, the US, Canada, Holland, etc. And here is something of an introduction to Babla and Kanchan on TikTok. I've just included the screen capture of the tags, the hashtags alongside this TikTok video as well. With the Guyanese flag behind them, the TikToker gives us a sense of the geographical breadth of Babla Kanchan's popularity, the range of flag emojis, regions, and hashtagged identity locations, serving as a pithy crystallization of the travels of the global popular. In a very recent special issue on the global popular, Bishnu Priya Ghosh and Bhaskar Sarkar situate the popular as an anchoring analytic for the global, while simultaneously tracking the dispersal of the local popular form from its national moorings. Reading the global through popular commercial film and musical forms like Babla Kanchan's orchestra highlights mobilizations of the global rooted in bottom-up DIY popular media practices, quite different in scale than culture industries like Bollywood, fueled by big media capital. That I'm just going to play one more TikTok video to give you a sense of the contemporary cultural production that involves a memorialization of Babla Kanchan. So this interest in Babla and Kanchan in contemporary Caribbean social media cultural production versus the kind of big budget Bollywood is reflected in what a lot of the secondary or double diaspora Indian Caribbean population, which is those who have migrated to the US, Canada, etc., from the Caribbean, their memorialization is celebratory of performers like Babla and Kanchan, who are often assumed to be Indo-Caribbean themselves, as that first TikTok video clarified. While these same social media kind of presences push back against traditional homeland diaspora dynamics of relation with India, emphasizing instead their own hybrid creolized cultures. Drag queen Tifa Wine, for instance, remarked in an event on Indo-Caribbean LGBTQ plus voices, quote, "I don't perform Bollywood. My work as Tifa Wine is about centering Caribbean narratives, so it can't be told through South Asianness. To do Bollywood would make no sense for Tifa Wine. I perform soca and chutney though," end quote. Christopher Ballanji and Daryl Baksh observe how, quote, "Much of the extant literature on Indian Caribbean culture focuses on continuities with India rather than the newness and complex fusions that characterize music, dance, and visual cultures in the post-indentured diaspora," end quote. So I wanted to set off the tone for what I will be returning to a period in the 70s and the 90s, but I wanted us to go there from this current moment of kind of cultural production of the diaspora on social media. But returning to Babla and Kanchan, from the 1970s through the 1990s, music orchestras of performers like Babla and Kanchan operated as a sort of shadow economy, as it were, to the Bombay film industry and the Caribbean music industries, foregrounding ground-level sensuous engagements with media and the informal, inventive, and tactical play with circulation circuits. If the global, note Ghosh and Sarkar in their special issue on the global popular, if the global functions as a dynamic galvanizer of the aspirational charge of the popular, operating as an affordance for popular agencies no longer held back by elite nationalist imaginations, then the popular disabuses the global of its universalist and elite cosmopolitan pretensions, grounding it firmly within local quotidian concerns. And so you see, even when I, as Swapnil mentioned in the introduction, when I worked with the Indian consulate in Trinidad, they had a very different sense of what quality Indian cinema was and were surprised that I was studying popular Indian cinema. So the global popular allows us to think about these kind of networks of globality through the popular commercial form rather than elite so-called cosmopolitan forms. Tracking Babla and Kanchan's travels across and between India, the Caribbean, and the quote-unquote global north alerts us to this generative dialectic between local, national, and global, holding simultaneously similarities, differences, and discontinuities between what are broadly referenced as Indian and Caribbean performance forms in each context of reception. Prior to Kanchan and Babla, Sundar Popo later hailed, my slides seem to be a little off, but I will find, so here are some images. There is Babla performing with the playback singer Mukesh and then his orchestra with Kanchan. Here are Babla and Kanchan in concert with Sundar Popo. Prior to Kanchan and Babla, Sundar Popo, hailed later as the king of chutney, had begun to lay the ground for this hybrid musical form, combining in his 1969 hit Nana and Nani and the many albums that followed, wedding folk songs, religious music, and other influences to create a new popular music with wide circulation. He reminisces in an interview, quote, I met Kanchan and Babla in 1969 when they came to perform at Presentation College in San Fernando. They heard me sing Nani Nana on the same program. When they returned in 1974, they released their own version of my songs. They appreciate the worldwide scope of Trinidad music, end quote. In the Caribbean, Babla and Kanchan had been introduced to Indo-Caribbean musical forms, as well as calypso and later soca. They'd returned home to India, to Bombay in particular, as Babla told me in an interview just last week. They returned with suitcases filled with records that they then experimented with, adding orchestral accompaniments to traditional folk songs. Babla says, I'm a rhythm arranger, so any song I listen to, I'm obsessed with rhythms. I increased the production value of chutney by bringing in a brass section and more elaborate orchestration, end quote. During the interview, Babla's son, Vaibhav, himself a budding music composer in Bombay, related how as a kid, he'd watch his parents hectically plan their international tours, not just making and rehearsing music, but also working with tailors, cobblers, designers on their stage costumes, shopping for funky buttons, sequins and lace, and embroidered leather to pop on stage. This production of a modern disco, calypso, reggae, and pop-informed stage persona and music attests to the cultural work that Babla and Kanchan were doing, spurred by their encounter with a different but similar set of musical and interlocutors in the Caribbean. Tina Ramnarayan observes, and I might have some images here, for example, of their costumes on stage and for these record covers. Tina Ramnarayan observes, performing arts practitioners, including dancers and musicians, play a central role in maintaining links between India and its diaspora. They also challenge ideas about diasporic otherness and national belonging, end quote. Performers like Babla Kanchan, on the periphery of the Bombay film industry, rarely recognized as Indian and not Indo-Caribbean by their numerous Trinidadian, Guyanese, and Surinamese fans, brought certain imaginations of local and global taste cultures to the work they did in remixing for this old Indian diaspora. They were stars in the Caribbean and minor players in India. They were Indo-Caribbean for their Caribbean fans, and in India, many assumed that they had emigrated to the Caribbean. They occupy thus a shifting liminal space across these two regions, as celebrities in the Caribbean and small-time players in India, as innovators and invisible music makers in the background, constantly hybridizing and remaking themselves in the process. If we consider in a trans and interoceanic framework, which the histories of enslavement and indenture across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds demand, Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic world as a memory scape marked by rhizomorphic fractal structures of the transcultural international formation, and Francois Vergès's figuration of the Indian Ocean world as a region composed of, quote, writing on water, the layers of texts, narratives, and imagined worlds. Then in Babla, Kanchan, and Sundar Popo's musical collaboration, this writing happens through what might be considered small-time actors, like orchestra performers and chutney singers. While Hindi film stars like Amitabh Bachchan, playback singers like Mukesh, or prime ministers like Indira Gandhi may have visited the Caribbean, they didn't engage with the region in the deep, sustained way that Kanchan and Babla did. This was a scene of hectic cultural traffic, not the benediction from above of an Indian celebrity visiting a faraway island, as many of these visits were described in the Indian press. Plotting these cosmopolitanisms from below enables us to see a much more exciting and equal cultural exchange that moves away from even post-colonial center-periphery dynamics and large, small scalar perspectives. We create new maps that queer the chronologies of European and post-colonial national modernities and directions of influence, so that the Caribbean becomes the engine of modernizing India when we tell the story through Babla and Kanchan. These are maps of cultural traffic plotted through DIY musical tours, suitcases filled with local records, and informal, initially amateur networks of entertainment production. I'll talk a little bit more about these travels from the Caribbean to India. I often have to clarify that my project is not about Indian cinema in the Caribbean, but Indian cinema and the Caribbean. The difference between the preposition and the conjunction in and marks critical distinctions between a study of Indian cinema assumed as a stable identity, a stable entity in a foreign location versus a study of two-way trans-regional, trans-cultural, cross-racial flows that trace invocations of the Caribbean in India and in its popular cinemas. It has been observed that scholars have become increasingly attuned to the critical role of Hindi cinema in the creation of diasporic longing for direct and twice migrants, as one scholar notes. However, a study of multi-way traffics is interested in how all sides are altered in that encounter. Rather than proposing Indian cinema as an anchor for its diaspora, while remaining a stable category itself, looking in from the outside, in my case as an Indian, decenters and reorients Hindi cinema and other Indian cinemas, if this project allows me to expand beyond Hindi cinema. Patrick Campos observes on watching Philippine cinema from the outside, quote, "Instead of the bounded territory pictured by national cinema, we conjure instead spaces of shared dwelling," end quote. When I watch Hindi cinema from the Caribbean, through the multi-sensorial intermedial reception practices of remixing, dancing, watching with or without subtitles as audiences engage in a range of intelligibilities, what becomes foregrounded is a Creole Bombay cinema, flagrantly hybrid, porous, peripatetic, and interwoven in multi-way cultural traffics. Manas Ray, in his study of the Indian diaspora in Fiji, notes that when we link diaspora media use with the life of media back in India, it narrates a very different story of media production, as always mixed, multi-layered, and unsettling definitions of national, ethnic, cultural identity. So my question for Babla and Kanchan, let me see if I can find another image to pause on. Right. So my question for Babla and Kanchan was, what reverberations from their Caribbean experiences did they carry to India? How did the Caribbean, through this circuit of singers and musicians who performed in orchestras, impact the soundscapes of Hindi cinema in faraway Bombay? Their albums Kaise Bani and Kuch Gadbad Hai were very popular in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in India, in northern India. And Babla remarks that some of those chutney songs are still sung at weddings in Bihar today. Rohit Jagesar, Babla Kanchan's promoter and producer of many of their hit albums, exulted in a phone interview just last evening, quote, "What was remarkable is that they brought this music back to India, while it seemed to us like music was always moving out of India to other places," end quote. We hear Kanchan's Kaise Bani remixed in the recent film Dabang 2, and I had an image, right, there it is. While the composer Sneha Kanwalkar traveled to Trinidad, to listen to Chutney for the film Gangs of Wasepur, having Chutney singers Videsh Sukhu and Nigel Salikram reprise the Surinamese singer Ramdev Chaito's 1950s songs. So these are travels of Bollywood in particular to Caribbean musical forms. In these instances, the Bhojpuri language travels to Bombay cinema via the Caribbean, mashed up with Afro-Caribbean rhythms as well, harking back to the creolized oceanic journeys that Babla and Kanchan's music undertook. Babla and Kanchan appropriated, remixed, and experimented as well with calypso songs like Arrow's Hot, Hot, Hot. We just heard the Hindi avatar Kuch Gadbad Hai, or Merchant's soca song Rocket as the Hindi Kuch Kuch Baby. These songs became extremely popular in India as well, remixed in turn in the 1990s into glossy music videos on Channel V and MTV, capturing spatial and temporal journeys across regions, changing economic infrastructures and media practices. But what I find most interesting about Babla Kanchan's borrowings from the Caribbean, however, are less overtly recognized imports of sounds, corporeal habitations, and new imaginations of relationships between cinema, music, and embodied fandom through dance. I had been curious, for instance, how the Calypsonian, I had an image of Lord Shorty here. I had been curious, for instance, how the Calypsonian soca pioneer Lord Shorty's 1978 song, Om Shanti Om, had made its way into the 1980 film Kars. Babla tells me the music composer Kalyanji's son traveled to Trinidad with him as the orchestra manager for Babla and Kanchan's orchestra. And he picked up Lord Shorty's album on LP there, which is how it found its way back to Bombay and into the other music composer duo Lakshmikant Pyarilal's score for the 1980 film Kars. In addition to their innovations in chutney music, Babla was a pioneer of disco dandiya. Of which, yes. Both in India and in the Gujarati diaspora abroad, and Gujarat is a state in Western India where dandiya, garba and dandiya are often performed during a 9-day festival called Navratri. He released his now legendary Babla Presents Non-Stop Disco Dandiya in 1981, and for years the sounds of disco beats mixed with Gujarati folk songs would reverberate late into the night through the 9 days of the Navratri festival, including in the Gujarati-dominated suburb of Bombay that I grew up in. Babla attributes his innovation in the dandiya soundscape to his foreign tours. When I traveled abroad, he says, I realized that one must also take care of other things, like the lighting, the sound, what you're wearing on stage. Every time I went abroad, he says, I got something new. I introduced many percussion instruments here, like the tumba, the timbales, which I later used for dandiya, and the octobans, end quote. The new pulsating rhythms of Babla's disco dandiya reveal corporeal connections and sonic intimacies between dancing bodies in the West Indies and those in Western India, where a musical arranger engages with and across musical forms, specially composed for dancing auditors. On one such foreign trip, Babla purchased rototom drums from Los Angeles. There he is. And put them to use in the massive hit Lela O Lela, sung by Kanchan in the 1980 film Kurbani, that those of you who know Indian cinema would be very familiar with. The song was inspired by the 1976 song Chicano by the African funk band Black Blood. I'm just trying to turn off these sounds. So the Hindi film song Lela O Lela was inspired by the 1976 song Chicano by the African funk band Black Blood, one of the many African and Afro-Caribbean European bands that influenced Hindi film music. For example, the song Jimmy Jimmy in the film Disco Dancer was kind of inspired by or plagiarized from the Afro-funk band Ottawan's song Teoke. So these were often Afro-Caribbean, located in Belgium, Holland, France, etc. Some of these bands included Boniem, Ottawan, and Osibisa, all wildly popular in the 70s and 80s India that I grew up in, and that were brought annually to our household in copied cassette tapes by an uncle who worked in the Gulf in Saudi Arabia, which marks yet another labor diaspora and another set of networks of the global popular exchange of global popular cultures. These exchanges between Black musical forms from Africa and across the African diaspora, musics from the indentured labor diaspora like chutney, Baithak, Ghana, etc., Hindi film music, and various Indian folk musical forms bring us to recognize what Lisa Lowe discusses as the intimacies of continents, of the performing bodies of colonized subjects that carry embodied rhythms that rub up against each other, their musical hybridities marking the rhythms of plantation, post-colonial, and globalized capital. As sounds that traveled from Africa to the Caribbean make their intermixed way to India through the promiscuous subterranean network of cassette tapes, orchestra performers, and DIY shows, the sounding of interwoven histories evokes intimacy as relation across differences, as a constellation of asymmetrical and unevenly legible sensory records of connected networks of memory. Of course, these are never simple love stories across the global South, complicated by distance in space and time, anxieties about originals and copies, preservation and loss. The Babla Kanchan love story with the Caribbean needs to be read alongside Sundar Popo's separate allegations that the Bombay film industry was stealing his material and didn't give him credit for it. The complex sonic politics of Lord Shorty's Om Shanti Om appearing in 2 Hindi blockbusters with no attribution to the source is not lost on the many Caribbean YouTube commenters on these videos, one of whom laments, quote, Raz Shorty, as he was also known, Lord Shorty, never received his royalties from the Kurz movie makers for the use and plagiarizing of his Om Shanti Om song. He complained about it in a 1996 interview he did with Radio Tempo in Trinidad, end quote. While another YouTube commenter remarks, quote, I couldn't believe they stole this exact song and yet love to say our chutney singers are unoriginal, end quote. Intimacy is never easy, and creolization is not a simple, equal process. Alert to power differentials, in a Babla Kanchan remix of an older Indo-Caribbean song, we may attune our hearing to the histories of continental intimacies, the intimate violence of the colonial movement of labor, and the intimacies of hybrid cultural production among those transported from Africa and Asia, resistant to the erasure of their practices, warily encountering the other's embodied cultural modes, rubbing up against and sometimes developing together hybrid Creole forms. Let's listen to a song, let's listen to Kanchan singing her very popular 1992 version of O Maninja, originally sung by the Indo-Guyanese artist Kasri Narayan in 1973. As the Instagrammer Cutlass Podcast describes it, quote, written in Guyanese Creole, the lyrics detail the hardships of agricultural labor and the realities of Indians toiling in the sugarcane fields. Many stories are told about how the indentured laborers would sing while working, airing their many grievances, end quote. And you can see the lyrics here on screen. What does it mean for Kanchan, an Indian, to sing O Maninja, a plea to and a complaint against the plantation manager? Is it just another catchy tune for Kanchan, while her Caribbean audiences carry in their contemporary beings, in their dancing bodies, the generational memories of the trauma and resilience of their ancestors who creatively captured affective states around labor exploitation, cultural memory, and migrant hustle through embodied musical and danced expression? Kanchan's performance of this Indo-Caribbean song mobilizes entangled, interlocking, overlaid histories of colonial and post-colonial, trans-regional, diasporic experience and labor networks. In listening to her and dancing with her, we might experience the combined entangled presence of an Indian female performer and the many quote-unquote coolie women, to use Gayatri Bahadur's phrase, in whose voice the song is articulated. We may sense, quote, the cumulative density of the memories of lives lived there, end quote, as Vilashini Kupan describes her Indian South African indentured labor diaspora identity. In Kanchan's spirited and very popular rendition of this and so many other plantation songs is a sense of these cultural forms around indenture becoming part of her inheritance too, transforming her from yet another orchestra vocalist to the definitive voice of Indo-Caribbean femininity for a few decades. She negotiates two similar yet different ideals of femininity as well in these performances, Indian and Indo-Caribbean, both of which have been studied by feminists in and across these locations. She develops a robust movement vocabulary on stage, challenging the ideals of playback femininity established by Indian singers like Lata Mangeshkar, and drawing as well the ire of traditionalist Indo-Caribbean commentators who raged against their women dancing in public at these chutney fetes or shows. If these songs were originally composed by the Jahaji Bhais and Behens, brothers and sisters, the shipkin who crossed the Kalapani or the Black Waters on the same ships that had earlier transported the enslaved from Africa, Kanchan was a late 20th century Behen or sister from India in a complicated relationship of cultural dialogue and labor with them. We cannot think of economic and cultural relations between India and the Caribbean without connecting them to the earlier traffic of human labor through enslavement and indenture. The cultural traffic of 20th century cinema and music is deeply imbricated with those earlier journeys. There are ghosts present in the traffic of videotapes, music records, singers, and orchestras, waves following upon waves of exchange grounded in desires and anxieties about cultural ties and amnesias in relation to the many homes that have been left behind and made over again. Through their Caribbean experience, in the deep creative encounter with the diaspora and with Afro-Caribbean music, Kanchan and Babla are initiated into a particular process of self-fashioning. We might even say, they get creolized in their encounter with the Caribbean. These musicians on the fringes of the Bombay film industry become Caribbean chutney performers. The musics they grew up with are woven in with Caribbean musics that have developed in vibrant hybrid contact with each other, producing a new modality of self-fashioning that's not just oral, but more expansively corporeal. There's a self-making at work here that marks a complex, messy relation between the logics of celebrity that demands skills of intercultural negotiation and canny profit-making, and genuine curiosity about this encounter with a familiar other, a porosity and openness to difference that allows for connections with different iterations of modernity than the Euro-American one, including what scholars like Lloyd Best have called Afro-Saxon modernity, or variously Creole modernity and Indo-Caribbean modernity. These musical encounters become occasions for theorizing the interweaving of memory, identity, and subjectivity, and point to the complexities of South-South engagements, of the enfoldings and unfoldings of cultural memory across racial difference and similarity. They demand thinking about encounter not just as a dyadic principle, master, slave, Indian, African, Indian, Indo-Caribbean, but as multiple, as producing polycentric accounts of cultural métissage, creolization, entanglement, intimacy. There is a whole range of frameworks one could think about this through. How do we keep slavery, indentured, post-colonial migrations apart and yet think them together? What are the layered, intertwined narratives of race and ethnicity that emerge when we work with what Vilashni Kupan calls a model of connective tissue to understand the entanglements of diasporic ethnicity? Kupan elaborates, quote, "The skeined sari and the geontology of my African blood reveal identity and memory too, as entangled, embodied, networked, woven, connected. Memory traverses individual acts of bodily recall and the larger constellations that put bodies and selves into a collective contact that is also a connective tissue, the holding together of family, ethnicity, diasporic community, and continental belonging," end quote. The rubbing up of one history against another produces a heterogeneric ensemble, an affinity that is not a sameness. Indeed, my study of the Indo-Caribbean, of Indian and Caribbean interactions constantly reminds me not to lapse into a utopian celebration of syncretic flows, but to ask what is also what is lost in translation. What are the gaps and untranslatabilities, the frictions and incongruencies reveal in the South-South traffic of unstable hierarchies? Edouard Lison, in his formulation of the poetics of relation, articulates relation's refusal of the Western requirement of transparency that seeks to render the other similar or equivalent. He claims instead the right to opacity. Opacities, he observes, can, quote, "coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these truly, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not on the nature of its components," end quote. This networked multiplicity characterizes musical and cinematic encounters, the ones that I've outlined today, and many more that I hope to address in this project. These are situated within a sensory history that makes audible and sensible the folds that bring histories into contact. During my Zoom interview with Babla, me in California, he in Bombay, his 3-year-old granddaughter Kyra jumps into the frame and starts belting out one of her grandma Kanchan's best-known chutney songs, "Pulauri Bina Chutney Kaise Bani," and paces across the room, a plastic microphone in hand, to mimic her grandma's big, energetic strides across the stage. Babla's son Vaibhav says, "None of us know Bhojpuri, but Kyra has learned from watching her dadi, her grandmother's videos online." On the same Zoom call, which turned into a delightful family affair, Babla's daughter-in-law, Insha, remarks that she grew up in Allahabad in Uttar Pradesh. And while she doesn't know Bhojpuri herself, she'd hear the same songs her daughter now sings, sung at weddings or hummed on the streets. She was surprised to hear this music in a Kutchi and Marathi-speaking Bombay household she married into. Within that hour and a half of what was supposed to be my interview with Babla Shah, we moved through the many histories of music and migration within and between India and the Caribbean over the past 2 centuries. What we have here then are the pulsating rhythms of the global popular that circulate across oceanic migrations, tracing unexpected trajectories of discovery, affinity, and influence. In conclusion, let me return to the image that accompanies the publicity for my talk today. The text on top presents Babla and Kanchan as a unit, and then Sundar Popo with a definitive period in between, echoing Kanchan's bindi, or the dot on her forehead. The text on this record cover would seem to accord almost equal weight to both sets of performers and performance traditions. And yet Popo's face recedes in the background, Babla is in the foreground, and Kanchan towers over both as the star performer of the new chutney genre. In this musical voyage, as the cover says, who exactly has voyaged where? What itineraries have this voyage taken each performer on? And which east meets which west? I don't know if you can see that, but below musical voyage, it says east meets west. This east meets west could reference Popo as the East Indian in the West Indies, or India from the east meeting the West Indies, or the East Indian music of Sundar Popo meeting the quote unquote Western beats of Babla's disco arrangements, which in turn, as we saw, draws upon an Afro-Western set of sounds. Or equally, the East could be the chutney songs from Bhojpuri-speaking Eastern India, meeting the Western beats of metropolitan Bombay on the West coast of India, which, as we've seen also, is entangled with multiple Wests. Like their music, this album cover captures aesthetic connections and affective intimacies while signaling the chaotic and not easily mappable traffic between South Asia and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you, Usha, for such an excellent and thought-provoking talk. To people that have questions, you can put it in the chat directly or use the raise hand function. I do have a question to sort of get us started. And so again, thank you, Usha, for such a brilliant talk. And I feel sort of compelled to ask you this question because I'm speaking from the subject position of a Bhojpuri Indian. And I want to sort of, maybe this would add another kind of layer of complexity to your project and this liminality that you talk about. I want to question the liminality of Babla and Kanchan and the liminality of Bhojpuri itself. So perhaps there is one more layer to be articulated in the production of this sort of global modernity, like through Bhojpuri, through power differentials and appropriations. Like I said, being a native Bhojpuri speaker, like Phulori Bina Chutney Kaise Bani, this song, like, I don't know like when it came about, but it has been sort of an intergenerational song in the Bhojpuri belt. So Bhojpuri as a sound and as a culture and how it is situated within Bollywood, to think about how Bhojpuri within the Indian context is dismissed as low culture, as plebeian. And I know early in your talk and towards the end too, you mentioned how Babla and Kanchan are related to Anandji, who is known like established Bollywood music director and producer. So the fact that there is this Marathi and Gujarati couple now appropriating Bhojpuri, and how does kind of that situate them and their positionality in the soundscape? And I find it fascinating that Bhojpuri then can have that level of respectability when it's filtered through the Caribbean, but not within India itself, and this kind of very complex working of power in this dynamic is very interesting to me. So I wonder if you have any thoughts. I just wanted to mention it in case you wanted to add it to your project going forward.
Absolutely. This is, in fact, it's going to be one of the nodes of this project, which right now is this many-headed hydra. And it'll really depend on where my own travels take me. But one of the locations that I do want to go to is the Bhojpuri speaking belt, as you called it, in the north and the east, in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand. And there's been a history of Caribbean returns to these regions as well, a problematic one as well, of going to what might be considered the homeland, but feeling a sense of deep alienation from the homeland. And so what is this? What is the function that the music is performing and the kind of symbolic work of Bhojpuri for contemporary Caribbean audiences is worth thinking about. But then within India, and Surbhi Sharma, who is a documentary filmmaker, has two very interesting documentary films. One called Jahaji Music that she made in Trinidad with Tejaswini Naranjana, the author of a book on India and the Caribbean, and another film called Bidesiya in Bombay, which is about Bhojpuri-speaking migrants to Bombay. So the project has to look at both within India, the kind of influences that come to Hindi cinema that make it a Creole Hindi cinema, and then what comes from the Caribbean by way of the Caribbean. What's happening in the 70s is that Bhojpuri cinema is not as big as it is today. Which is also tied in very much with digital technologies. So there are also temporal dimensions to how Bhojpuri cinema and music become visible in Bombay cinema in the contemporary moment versus, say, 40 or 50 decades ago. 4 or 5 decades ago. And Babla and Kanchan belong to that particular moment, which completely changes in its contemporary iterations. But everything that you're saying is also important for thinking about digital media fan practices that also now span this whole range of an Indo-Caribbean double diaspora to a kind of rural and small town Bhojpuri speaking Indian population, both of whom are able to encounter each other precisely through this memorialization of Babla and Kanchan's songs, among many other songs. And so what are the traffics of cassette tape record circulations to Uttar Pradesh and Bihar is something that I have to trace. I'm still in my comfort zone of Bombay cinema, and what this requires is to take me actually to a much less familiar North India versus the Caribbean, which feels a little more familiar, which is what I was trying to get at with these multiple modernities that we think constitute metropolitan Indian modernity today as well.
Maybe, I mean, so just speaking from experience of relatives, like who are these kind of diasporic migrants from East UP, like the fact that how, as you were talking about how a Caribbean identity is different, like is divorced from like it's a very specific chutney music that they're articulating. What I've noticed is for the diaspora, for the multi-generational diaspora that does count or does seek that sort of belonging, it's a very Bhojpuri like they do not know Hindi at all, but speak Bhojpuri. So it's their home is just East UP, like that's all. Like the connection to India at large is far lesser than the Bhojpuri homeland. So, you know, that's sort of a parallel I felt.
Yes, and that is why when I had sent the abstract for this talk, I was thinking about the trans-regional as an important vector of exploration. I didn't get to it as much today. I was trying to pack in everything and did go over my time limit as well. But it gives you a sense of also when you're early in a project, it's like a crystal. You can look at it from different sides and come to it from different angles. And what I came to it from today was also I wanted to provide enough of a description of why studying this is important. But as you mentioned, the Bhojpuri diaspora is a trans-regional diaspora. It moves away from older, until a decade ago, Indian film studies was also very much tied up within the national cinema network. And it is with the global Tamil diaspora, for example, and the global Bhojpuri diaspora that there is pushback against these kind of formations of national cinematic modernity. I am very interested as well in the Tamil Caribbean diaspora, in the Francophone Caribbean, for example, in Guadeloupe, in Martinique, etc. And this is spoken about much less, but there are religious ritual practice around kind of Devi worship in many of these cultures. And I'm interested to see what happens to music in these locations, because when I was in Trinidad, people would often say, and these were Indo-Caribbean societies interested in a preservation, a kind of traditionalist preservation of Indian identity. And they would say, oh, in Jamaica or in St. Lucia or in Martinique, the Indians have been assimilated into Black culture. For them, that was something to look down upon, right? So, but I'm curious, even within India, there is the kind of discussion about the hegemony of Hindi cinema over other language cinemas and other regions. How does this play out in a much older diaspora?
So you can use the raise hand function if you have, okay. Inderjeet, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It was just so interesting and thought-provoking. So I'm an ethnomusicologist who teaches here, and I teach regularly a class on Bollywood song and dance. And typically, a good percentage of my class consists of South Asian heritage students, so in the diaspora. And one thing that strikes me always is that they are so surprised with all these insights that scholars are bringing, to song and dance. And for them, it's just enjoyment, it's just dance music, it's so rhythmic, and especially as it has become hybridized, etc. And at the end of the course, they will say, wow, I never thought of this. I danced to this song so many times, and this never occurred to me. But even as they become a little more informed or want to become informed, I also feel that they often don't quite relate to the issues scholars are raising. And so my question is, both in terms of the kind of sensorial, corporeal, affective transmissions that you're talking about, and also the sort of temporal sweep back to the plantation and the violence of that time, especially through the text, such as the song you had from Kanchan, that you showed us. So over generations, how much of this sort of these kind of issues are really sensorial, corporeal for the later generations? And I realize this is kind of an ethnographic question, but I would love to hear some of your thoughts. And another aspect of it is, that the whole thing is embedded in neoliberal capitalism, and are these modes of hybridization, and some of it is there. They are sort of embedded in commodification and the profits to be made. And so how do you kind of see the two enmeshing, and which way, do you think the scale tilting, especially going forward?
Thank you so much, Inderjeet. And I am a fan of your work as well. In fact, giving this talk at Michigan has been interesting because I see Alia Khan there and Mrinalini Sinha. So many of you your work is really generative for me to think about and think through this next project. The question of what I have found, and the pandemic in a way has made me really think hard about and look very carefully at social media fandom, at kind of these new forms of digital fandom. And there, a lot of the double diasporic Indo-Caribbean fans or people who post about music, or even the many events that I've attended online on Zoom in the past year and a half, are not focused on these connections back with the homeland, back with India. As I mentioned, some of them, I've quoted people who push back against that constant kind of, that the Indian scholar is constantly looking for in the study of the diaspora. Instead, they kind of are fashioning themselves, or are forced to fashion themselves, as many of us are, in thinking along racial dynamics as defined in the United States or wherever in the global north they live. So that they're kind of speaking about intergenerational trauma much more than, say, my students were even 6 years ago in Trinidad. And I would have to travel back to Trinidad and go to Guyana and Suriname to see what young people there are kind of, how are they forging their racial and ethnic identities in relation to popular culture. But within the global north, many of these conversations are kind of along the discussions of kind of intergenerational trauma of the indentured labor diaspora. And this is also why I realized that creolization that I'm using as a kind of framework, and I'm still not sure where I'm going to land with this, can be problematic because I think, as Alia Khan herself has also said, the Creole and the hybrid have become the kind of dominant modes of understanding Caribbean identity, but the Indo-Caribbean figure is often left out of that. It's an Afro-Creole identity, that creolization, and creolite, as Ananya Jahanara Kabir has also written about how to move beyond creolite and coolitude, these kind of two frameworks that often inform our study of the older Indian diasporas. And where does that take us to? So that's one way of getting at the question you're asking. Is there still this experience of trauma that happens when you're listening to the song? When I'd first heard the song, I thought it was a beautiful, catchy tune. And it was the podcast on the Insta kind of post on the podcast, Cutlass podcast, is actually a young person in Florida who's trying to learn Bhojpuri, who's trying to kind of document and archive these songs on digital platforms like Instagram and TikTok to preserve what his grandmother's ways of dressing and speaking, etc. So they take us to a different kind of kind of forging of Indo-Caribbean identities in the global north. The question about the commercial.
Well, can I just ask us one little thing about this before you move on to the commercial? So if you looked at the, I mean, if there is a YouTube of this song, for example, the one you showed, and if there are responses of the viewers, is there connection to the text and the history within those comments, or is it still like a ethnographic question to be pursued?
I have to look at that particular video. Most of which also gives us a sense of what kinds of audiences turn to YouTube versus Instagram versus TikTok. There is an age. So a lot of the YouTube commenters are much older and turn to Babla and Kanchan in this particular instance with a sense of nostalgia. Those were the days, or they will say about Lord Shorty's music, because people say, oh, he picked up from bhajans that he heard in growing up in an Indo-Caribbean dominated village in Trinidad. Those bhajans in turn were set to the tunes of Hindi film songs, so that there is a circularity to this appropriation, multi-way appropriation of sounds. But people in the comments there would say, if you grew up in the Caribbean, you would not kind of fight over what is Indian, what is African. There is a different kind of sensibility there of let us live in peace, let's not give in to the divide and rule policy of our British masters, etc. Whereas younger Indo-Caribbean, especially double diasporic, encounters with these forms are very different. And that is why the turn to TikTok and Instagram is interesting. And I think that deserves, I need to think much harder about each of these digital forms.
So I distracted you from, there's another question, but we can talk about the commodification and
that's always
aspects.
Yeah, I think any study of popular culture kind of encounters that front and center right off the bat, that it will always be both and. It is, and what you kind of want to hold in studies of popular culture is how do we, and this was something I was trying to do in my first book as well, how do we hold on to the pleasure that we actually, all of us experience with popular culture, with the global popular? How do we not separate ourselves as scholars from that corporeal embodied pleasure that we ourselves experience, even as we know it's commodifying, it's oppressive kind of hold over us, right?
Aliyah, please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Iyer. Thank you so much for that generative and really intersectionally generative talk. I have two questions and maybe one comment, but I will be concise, so not to take up people's time. The first question is, I wonder what you would make of the elision between the popular and the religious when this Indo-Caribbean music is translated and reproduced by Indian singers and musicians. I wasn't thinking so much of Babla and Kanchan, but I was thinking more of Jagjit Singh and Chitra's, his wife Chitra's album Live in Trinidad, where, you know, it's this 2-cassette album where one album is Hindu devotional music and the other one is Islamic devotional qasidas. And, you know, they occupy this really weird place between like, are they popular music? Because sometimes you will hear them in popular venues, but then you'll also hear them at religious gatherings, and not even the original songs that the Indo-Caribbean laborers brought over with them, but the renditions by Jagjit and Chitra in these religious spaces. That's the first question. The second one is, maybe you could just help me think through this moment, this like thing I saw, in terms of like, what does it mean in Bombay film transmission terms? So, you know, it occurred to me that at least generationally, Shah Rukh Khan has replaced Amitabh Bachchan as, you know, the figure that everybody thinks about. And then I learned that he now owns the Trinidadian team in the Caribbean Premier Cricket League. So he's often in Trinidad. And I've seen videos of him going up on stage and singing with these guys to promote his cricket team, his Trinidadian cricket team. So maybe we could just, I'd be so interested to hear you think about what is that moment? What does that mean in terms of like Bombay film transmission? And then the quick comment was, you know, in thinking about the geographic nodes of your project, you know, India itself, North India, South India differently, and then the Caribbean and other diaspora communities. Speaking of Vilashini Kopan's work, I was wondering if South Africa can be another one. And I say that because when I was in Cape Town in 2005 in, you know, a curry shop. And I heard Kaise Bani and I nearly dropped dead because that was like the last place, you know, I heard Babla and Kanchan's Kaise Bani in that curry shop in Cape Town. And that was like the last place I was expecting to hear it. But why not, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I'll go backwards from the South Africa example. And it's actually just such an honor to be here with you. Iyer, your work is so important, as I mentioned to Inderjeet as well. So I've been really excited just to meet all of you, and I wish it were in person. And I say that because actually the first question about religion, what is so important, and what struck me when I first went to Trinidad was I went in 2014. It's almost like I was running away from Modi's India to the Caribbean as an escape from Hindutva and Hindutvaizing India. And I was very surprised and initially very, you know, very happy to see how religion and just the names, you'd have names of scholar friends like Patricia Mohammed or Gabriel Hussein that cross, you know, religious kinds of divides, or that intermarriage between Indo-Caribbeans across religious divides is not considered kind of a problem. All of that seemed really liberatory, but being in Trinidad for long enough also kind of revealed this kind of the long arm of the Sangis and the temples that are being built across the Caribbean as a kind of showing off of Hindutva's strong force. And, you know, kind of Indians from India telling Trinidadians how they should be doing the right rituals in temples, sending sculptors over to build their temples, etc. So I think we are in a very, very particular moment in the past 2 decades of what is happening within the kind of Caribbean religious space, Indo-Caribbean religious space. Jagjit and Chitra Singh are really interesting because they are so middlebrow, both in India. In India, especially, they're middlebrow. The ghazal is a middlebrow kind of genre. It's not classical, it's not Drupad or Khayal, but it's not Hindi film music. And they kind of cross, they're in between this kind of middlebrow ghazal music, and they also perform in Hindi films. When they perform in Hindi films, it gives cultural cachet to the cinema. So there are these kind of layers and striations, which I noticed definitely in Trinidad as well. There would be people who would send their children to Kathak classes rather than Bollywood dance classes because they wanted them to get proper Indian culture. or the Satmaraj kind of rage over Indian women dancing at chutney fetes was about, this is not Indian culture, right? And they were being kind of scolded and told to kind of mold into different ideas of femininity. So, and I think the use of Jagjit Chitra and of ghazals in both Hindu and Muslim religious locations is really what makes the Caribbean interesting to an Indian, that these, the kind of the blocks that are formed around these musical and performance cultures in general in India kind of become looser in the Caribbean. And that allows us to actually see their contours better rather than studying them within their boxes as one might in India or in Pakistan. And so to think about festivals, Carnival, Jose, all of these also bring up the kind of thoughts about how these are performed in India. One of the notes that I want to think about is, in fact, the use of film music in festivals, in these public kind of demonstrations of religious ecstasy. And the thing that comes close to religious ecstasy across South Asia and the Caribbean is cricket. So that's the other thing, right? And I'm feeling like I'm rambling, but somehow between Modi's Hindutva, Shah Rukh Khan, the attacks on Shah Rukh Khan recently in India, and this kind of becoming a cricket Mughal alongside a Bollywood Mughal, something is very much at play. And it is in transition, even as we speak. I feel like a lot of the kind of Muslim stardom of the Khans is on very shifty ground right now, given how dangerous the discourse in India is at this moment. It would be very interesting to see what someone like Akshay Kumar, who has become the Hindutva poster boy of Bollywood, does, what he thinks of his Caribbean fans, what his interactions might be. So thank you for all of those questions. South Africa is just going to expand. I have a colleague, Debashri Mukherjee, who's thinking about Indian cinema and indenture in Fiji, Mauritius, the Indian Ocean world. So I think we've sort of agreed that I'm going to kind of think about the Caribbean and she's going to think about the Indian Ocean. But I think it's impossible for anyone studying these to not think about transoceanic connections.
All right, so that's all we have. Well, we have time for one very short question. If anybody has a short question. Yes, Supriya, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo everyone and say what a wonderful talk this has been. Not so much a question, although I have many, but since we don't have time for questions, I just want to get back to the respectability politics that Swapnil had raised when she talked about the regional issues, and the class issues, the fact that Bhojpuri is considered plebeian, rural, and so on. You had mentioned the outrage over Hindu women dancing, for instance. Now, I know you grew up in Bombay, Usha. I grew up in the South. And now talking about importation, the Sangeet has been imported into South Indian weddings. And there's a lot of Bollywood swiveling of hips and dancing, just causing absolute outrage and sometimes humorous outrage. So I just wanted to say that it's not simply what's happening outside India, but also what's happening within India. So I love the reading of the East meets West, which East and which West, and the multiple readings you did of it, because I think that's where, I'm thinking of Gayatri Gopinath's work here, in which she looks at diaspora as not the so-called motherland, and diaspora binary, drawing, I guess, from Stuart Hall, where is the origin? Because I felt that was what was most compelling about your talk, that you were unsettling any question of an origin that comes from India and then goes elsewhere. Because as I was saying, even within India, there's a lot of movement going on and a lot of change. So it would be fascinating to look at all these circuits.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Supriya. In fact, Gayatri's work, I removed the quote at the last minute because the paper was getting that long, but it's central to thinking about the region. And in fact, to think about what she calls a queer regional imaginary. one of the chapters that I do think will be there, even as I'm kind of playing with what else might go into the book, is to think about queerness and in particular about drag performance and how it mobilizes film music to kind of perform gender nonconformity among Caribbean diasporic subjects. But along with what you're saying about East-West, what is also getting destabilized is North-South, because to call the Caribbean the global South in this context is it kind of flattens the multiple modernities at work, and it flattens the kind of contribution of Caribbean. From what I know, from what I'm tracing, it's Afro-Caribbean influences on disco in 70s Europe and North America, but there might be more to that story. But that again disrupts North-South binaries, easy binaries as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Usha. So we have 4 more minutes. So if you have any last remarks, Usha, we can end there. Or if anybody else has a short question, I guess Inderjeet has. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to share a little bit more talking about the regional issues that, and one thing actually I wanted to say, I grew up in Bihar and spoke Bhojpuri as a young girl, even though I'm Punjabi and Sikh by heritage. And so, just listening to Bhojpuri for me, just it's a corporeal, sensorial kind of affective connection. Just going back to the reactions of students, etc. What I felt was that, in fact, of all these kinds of issues that we might raise, the issue of interregional disparities and differences and stereotyping and, creation of hierarchies or hybridities and things sort of excites them the most. And just what, Supriya and Iyer said, the students of South Indian heritage are really sort of moved by these, the North-South, kind of disparity that has existed. And interestingly, being in Mumbai, Bollywood sort of is a seat of kind of, making, being an expression of that. So just sort of sharing, how rich your model and your framework is.
Thank you. I don't know if I have a framework yet. I feel like I'm just tossing about in the sea of so many kind of rich frameworks. But I think hierarchies will get seriously destabilized when we kind of do this transregional analysis. There was something I was going to say. The question of class had come up. I think Supriya brought it up. And I think that is a very important question, because some of the film curators, people in the Caribbean that I've been reaching out to interview over Zoom, kind of said, we didn't listen to Babla Kanchan growing up. There was a kind of condescension. And so there is clearly a kind of class, and also Babla Kanchan's tours in, say, New York or Toronto or Amsterdam were attended by certain kinds of Indian and Indo-Caribbean populations as well, diasporic populations. So there is a kind of, there's a lot to be unearthed there as well, in terms of class and cultural capital.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for attending, and hope y'all have a good weekend. Bye. Thank you, Usha.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.